Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath and every word, one moment of silence spoke louder than any royal decree. It was a silence that would shatter relationships, redefine loyalties, and expose the brutal reality of what it truly means to marry into the world's most watched family. When King Charles III finally ascended to the throne he had waited decades to claim, the world expected celebration, unity, and the healing of old wounds. Instead, they witnessed something far more shocking, a deliberate, calculated rejection that would leave Camilla's family standing in the cold shadow of royal disapproval, their voices echoing in empty corridors where once they had been welcomed. This is not a story of crowns and ceremonies. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of what happens when personal feelings collide with royal duty, when family bonds are tested by the weight of a 1,000-year-old institution, and when silence becomes the most devastating weapon of all. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the modern monarchy and the price of wearing the crown. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Clarence House as Charles Philip Arthur George prepared for what would become the most defining conversation of his reign. It was 3 weeks after his coronation, and the weight of the crown still felt foreign on his head, though he had spent 74 years preparing for this moment. Outside his study window, he could see the familiar figures of his security detail, but today their presence felt more like prison guards than protectors. Camilla had been unusually quiet during breakfast, her normally bright chatter replaced by nervous fidgeting with her pearl necklace. She knew what was coming, though neither of them had spoken about it directly. The palace walls seemed to have ears, and certain conversations were better left unspoken until absolutely necessary. The relationship between Charles and Camilla's family had always been complicated, a delicate web of forced smiles and careful words that had somehow held together through decades of public scrutiny. Her children, Tom and Laura, had maintained a respectful distance from royal duties, understanding instinctively that their presence often created more problems than it solved. But now, with Charles as king, the dynamics had shifted completely. Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's ex-husband, had once been a close friend of Charles. They had shared hunting expeditions, polo matches, and countless evenings at country estates. Their friendship had survived the complexities of Charles's relationship with Camilla, though it had required careful navigation and an almost diplomatic level of discretion. But friendship was one thing. Being the ex-husband of the queen consort was something entirely different. The transformation had begun subtly, in the weeks leading up to the coronation. Invitations that once arrived as a matter of course suddenly stopped coming. Social events that had included Camilla's extended family for years were restructured to exclude them. Palace staff, once warm and accommodating, became professionally distant when dealing with anyone bearing the Parker Bowles name. Tom Parker Bowles, a successful food critic and author, found himself caught in an impossible situation. His mother was now queen consort, but his own relationship with the royal establishment had become strained to the breaking point. Reporters constantly hounded him for comments about his stepfather the king, while palace officials made it clear that any public statements would be carefully scrutinized for appropriateness. The pressure was most evident during the coronation planning. Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter, had expected to play some role in the historic ceremony. She had quietly supported her mother through years of public criticism and had earned respect within royal circles for her discretion and loyalty. Yet when the final guest lists were distributed, her family's section seemed notably smaller than expected. Charles found himself caught between two impossible forces. On one side was his love for Camilla and his desire to honor her family, to show the world that his marriage was not just a personal choice, but a full acceptance of everything that came with it. On the other side was the weight of institutional pressure, the subtle but persistent voices of advisors who worried about public perception and the delicate balance of royal relationships. The palace courtiers, those shadowy figures who wielded enormous influence behind closed doors, had never fully embraced Camilla's family. They tolerated them during Charles's years as Prince of Wales, understanding that some accommodation was necessary for the sake of harmony. But now that Charles wore the crown, different rules applied. Every relationship had to be evaluated through the lens of royal protocol and public benefit. Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, had been particularly vocal about the need for clear boundaries. During one late-night meeting, he had carefully explained the complexities of having too many family members with unofficial status hanging around the palace. Every additional person meant more security considerations, more opportunities for media complications, and more potential for awkward situations at state functions. The conversation had been couched in diplomatic language, but the message was clear. Camilla's family had served their purpose during the transition period, but now that Charles was king, streamlining was necessary. The monarchy needed to project strength and unity, not the messy complications of blended families and ex-spouses. Camilla herself was walking a tightrope. She understood the pressures Charles faced better than anyone, having watched him struggle with similar decisions throughout their relationship. She had seen how the institution could grind down even the strongest personal relationships, turning love into duty and spontaneity into carefully choreographed performance. Yet she also felt a fierce loyalty to her children and grandchildren, to the people who had stood by her during the darkest years of public criticism. Tom and Laura had never asked to be thrust into the spotlight, but they had handled the attention with grace and dignity. They deserved better than to be slowly edged out of their mother's new life. The breaking point came during a family gathering at Balmoral, traditionally a time when the royals could relax and be themselves away from public scrutiny. Camilla had hoped that the informal setting would allow her family to blend naturally with Charles's children and grandchildren. Instead, the weekend highlighted every tension and awkwardness that had been building for months. Prince William, now heir to the throne, maintained polite but distant relationships with Camilla's children. He understood the necessity of accepting his father's wife, but extending that acceptance to her entire extended family felt like a step too far. The ghost of his mother, Princess Diana, still influenced his feelings about Camilla, and, by extension, everyone connected to her. Princess and Charles's sister had never been known for diplomatic patience. Her interactions with Tom and Laura during the Balmoral weekend were correct, but notably cool. She had spent decades watching her brother navigate the complications of his love life, and now that he was king, she believed it was time to prioritize royal duty over personal sentiment. The children sensed the tension immediately. Prince George, William's eldest son, asked innocent questions about why some people at family gatherings seemed to know each other better than others. Princess Charlotte wondered aloud why Granny Camilla's son didn't live at the palace like other family members. These innocent observations hit Charles like physical blows, highlighting the artificial divisions being created within what should have been a natural family unit. Charles's own children, William and Harry, represented different approaches to the situation. William, conscious of his role as future king, understood the institutional pressures, but wished there could be a more graceful solution. Harry, despite his own complicated relationship with the family, felt sympathy for anyone being excluded from royal circles. The media, always hungry for royal drama, began to pick up on the subtle changes in family dynamics. Photographers noted who appeared at which events, and who seemed to be missing from traditional gatherings. Royal correspondents started asking careful questions about the role of step-families in the new reign, wondering aloud whether Charles's marriage would truly unite two families or simply create new divisions. Palace officials worked overtime to manage the narrative, emphasizing the king's commitment to a slimmed-down monarchy and the natural evolution of royal relationships. But behind the carefully crafted press releases, the reality was far more painful and personal. Camilla's grandchildren were perhaps the most affected by the growing distance. They had grown up thinking of Charles as a beloved grandfather figure, someone who would always be part of their lives. Now they found themselves navigating complex rules about when they could visit, which events they could attend, and how they should behave in public. The situation reached a crisis point when Tom Parker Bowles published a food article that included casual references to his mother's new role and some behind-the-scenes glimpses of royal life. The piece was harmless by any objective standard, but palace officials reacted as if he had violated state secrets. The angry phone calls and demands for editorial control sent a clear message. Camilla's family was expected to be seen but not heard, present but not participating. Charles found himself spending sleepless nights pacing the corridors of whatever residence he was occupying, trying to reconcile his personal feelings with his royal obligations. He loved Camilla completely, but that love was being tested by the impossible choice between supporting her family and maintaining the delicate balance of royal relationships that kept the institution functioning. The pressure was taking its toll on his marriage as well. Camilla, usually so supportive and understanding, began to show signs of strain. She had sacrificed much to be with Charles, enduring years of public criticism and personal attacks. Now she was being asked to sacrifice her family's comfort and security for the sake of royal protocols that seemed increasingly arbitrary and cruel. Late-night conversations between Charles and Camilla became exercises in careful diplomacy rather than intimate exchanges between husband and wife. Each conversation about family events or holiday plans carried the potential for conflict, as they tried to balance their personal desires with the expectations being placed upon them by advisors, other family members, and the institution itself. The staff at Clarence House noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. The easy warmth that had characterized the household during Charles's years as Prince of Wales was being replaced by a more formal, cautious environment. Conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms, and the relaxed family dinners that had been a hallmark of Charles and Camilla's life together became rare and carefully managed affairs. As autumn approached, and Charles's first Christmas as king loomed on the horizon, the family dynamics that had seemed manageable during his years as heir apparent were threatening to tear apart the very foundations of his personal happiness. The crown that he had waited so long to wear was beginning to feel less like an achievement and more like a burden that might cost him everything he held dear outside of his royal duties. The first major public indication that something had shifted came during the annual Royal Windsor Horse Show, an event that had traditionally been a relaxed family affair where royal protocol took a backseat to genuine enjoyment of equestrian sports. For years, Camilla's family had been regular attendees, with Tom and Laura often spotted chatting casually with various royals in the members' enclosure. This year, however, the seating arrangements told a different story. Palace staff had quietly redesigned the royal viewing area, creating subtle but unmistakable hierarchies that placed Camilla's children and their families at a notable distance from the main royal party. The message was clear to anyone who understood palace protocol. Proximity to the monarch was being carefully controlled, and not everyone who had once enjoyed access would continue to do so. Laura Lopez found herself in a particularly awkward position during the event. As an accomplished equestrian herself, she had always felt comfortable in the horse show environment, discussing breeding lines and competition strategies with fellow enthusiasts. But now she noticed that conversations would halt when she approached certain groups, and invitations to private box viewings that had once been routine were no longer forthcoming. The most painful moment came when her young daughter, Eliza, ran excitedly toward King Charles to share her enthusiasm about a particularly impressive dressage performance. Charles's face lit up with genuine affection as he bent down to listen to the child's animated description, but the quick intervention of a protection officer, gently but firmly redirecting the little girl back toward her family section, created an uncomfortable silence that seemed to echo across the entire viewing area. Camilla watched the exchange with a heavy heart, recognizing the beginning of a pattern that would only become more pronounced as Charles's reign continued. The spontaneous family moments that had made their blended household feel natural and loving were being systematically eliminated in favor of rigid protocols that prioritized royal dignity over human connection. Behind the scenes, the pressure was building from multiple directions. The palace's senior advisors were becoming increasingly concerned about public perception and the need to establish clear boundaries around the new king's extended family relationships. Sir Clive Alderton had commissioned a detailed analysis of media coverage, and the results were troubling from an institutional perspective. Public opinion polls showed that while Charles and Camilla as a couple enjoyed reasonable approval ratings, the inclusion of her extended family in royal events created confusion and sometimes negative reactions among respondents. Focus group participants expressed concerns about the expanding royal family and questions about who deserved public funding and protection. The financial implications were indeed significant. Every family member who attended royal events required security assessments, background checks, and protection services. The cumulative cost of maintaining these extended relationships was beginning to draw attention from parliamentary budget committees who were already scrutinizing royal expenditures with increasing intensity. Prince William, as heir apparent, found himself in an impossible position between family loyalty and institutional responsibility. He genuinely liked Tom and Laura Parker Bowles as individuals, but he was acutely aware that every decision made during his father's reign would set precedents for his own future monarchy. The idea of managing an ever-expanding circle of step-relatives and their children was daunting from a practical standpoint. During a private meeting with his father at Highgrove, William carefully broached the subject that everyone was thinking about, but no one wanted to discuss directly. The conversation took place in Charles's beloved organic garden, away from the potential electronic surveillance that made honest discussion difficult in more formal palace settings. William spoke with the careful diplomacy that his royal training had instilled in him, but his message was clear. The monarchy needed to project stability and continuity, not the complexities of modern blended families. He pointed out that public confusion about who exactly counted as royalty was already creating protocol nightmares at state functions and international events. Charles listened with growing frustration, understanding the logic of his son's arguments while feeling increasingly trapped by the very institution he had spent his entire life preparing to lead. The irony was not lost on him that becoming king meant having less freedom to make personal choices, not more. The international dimension added another layer of complexity to the situation. Foreign governments and diplomatic protocols struggled to understand the status of Camilla's family members when planning state visits and official functions. Questions about precedence, titles, and appropriate levels of recognition created constant headaches for the Foreign Office staff who managed royal diplomatic relationships. During a state visit from the French president, the confusion reached embarrassing levels when Tom Parker Bowles was initially included in official dinner plans, then quietly removed after questions arose about his exact status within the royal family. The last-minute changes created awkward explanations and highlighted the need for clearer guidelines about family inclusion in official events. Camilla herself was beginning to feel the strain of constantly navigating between her loyalty to her children and her commitment to supporting Charles in his new role. She had always prided herself on being a practical person who could adapt to changing circumstances, but the systematic exclusion of her family was testing her emotional reserves in ways she hadn't anticipated. The breaking point came during the planning for the king's first official birthday celebration. Traditionally, the monarch's birthday involves multiple events ranging from intimate family gatherings to large public ceremonies. The question of which family members would be included in which events became a source of intense behind-the-scenes negotiation. Tom Parker Bowles had assumed he would be invited to at least the private family dinner, as had been the custom during Charles's years as Prince of Wales. When no invitation arrived, he initially assumed it was an oversight. A careful inquiry through Camilla revealed that the omission was entirely intentional, decided at the highest levels of palace management. The conversation between Camilla and Charles about her son's exclusion was one of the most difficult of their marriage. Camilla, usually so understanding about the pressures Charles faced, found herself unable to accept what felt like a direct rejection of her family. Charles, torn between his love for his wife and the relentless pressure from his advisors, struggled to explain decisions that he wasn't entirely comfortable with himself. The argument escalated when Camilla pointed out the hypocrisy of excluding her children while continuing to include various distant cousins and royal hangers-on whose connection to the family was based purely on bloodline rather than genuine relationship. She asked Charles directly whether he was ashamed of her family, a question that cut to the heart of their relationship dynamic. Charles's response was careful but devastating in its honesty. He explained that shame had nothing to do with it, but that royal protocols had evolved over centuries to serve specific purposes. The inclusion of step-family members set precedents that could complicate future generations and create expectations that might become impossible to maintain. Camilla's reaction was swift and pointed. She reminded Charles that she had given up much of her previous life to support him, enduring years of public criticism and personal attacks. The idea that her children, who had also made sacrifices to accommodate their relationship, would now be systematically excluded from family celebrations felt like a betrayal of the promises that had been made during their courtship. The tension spilled over into their public appearances, with royal watchers noting a subtle but unmistakable coolness between the king and queen consort during official events. Camilla's usual warm smile seemed forced, and Charles appeared distracted and uncomfortable during what should have been triumphant moments in his reign. Palace staff members began to notice the change in household dynamics immediately. The easy camaraderie that had characterized Charles and Camilla's pre-coronation life was being replaced by careful conversations and diplomatic exchanges that felt more like negotiations between allies than intimate discussions between spouses. The ripple effects extended to Charles's relationship with his own children as well. Prince Harry, already estranged from much of the family, saw the treatment of Camilla's children as confirmation of his own criticisms about the institution's capacity for cruelty toward anyone who didn't fit perfectly into royal molds. William, while understanding the institutional pressures, began to worry about the long-term impact on his father's marriage and personal happiness. He had watched Charles wait decades to marry the woman he loved, and now that marriage was being tested by the very crown Charles had spent his life preparing to wear. The media attention was becoming increasingly focused on the family dynamics, with royal correspondents asking pointed questions about the absence of certain family members from official events. Palace press officers worked overtime to deflect these inquiries, but the pattern was becoming too obvious to ignore completely. International media were particularly interested in the story, with foreign publications drawing comparisons to other modern monarchies that had successfully integrated stepfamilies and blended relationships into their royal structures. The British approach was beginning to look antiquated and unnecessarily rigid by comparison. As Christmas approached, the question of holiday arrangements became the ultimate test of how far the exclusion policy would extend. Traditional royal Christmas celebrations at Sandringham had always been carefully choreographed affairs, but they had also maintained some flexibility for acknowledging the reality of modern family structures. The decision about whether to invite Camilla's children and grandchildren to join the Christmas gathering would send a clear message about the future of their relationship with the royal family. Charles found himself facing a choice that would define not only his reign but the fundamental character of his marriage and his role as a stepfather and step-grandfather. The pressure was mounting from all sides, with advisors pushing for clear boundaries and family members hoping for inclusion and acceptance. In the quiet moments between official duties, Charles began to realize that the crown he had waited so long to wear might cost him the very relationships that had given his life meaning and joy during his years as heir apparent. The first Christmas of Charles's reign would later be remembered not for its celebrations, but for its conspicuous absences. The guest list for Sandringham, traditionally announced with diplomatic care to avoid public speculation, was notably smaller than in previous years. When pressed by journalists, palace spokespersons offered vague explanations about the king's desire for a more intimate celebration and quality time with immediate family. Tom and Laura Parker Bowles received the news through Camilla herself, in a conversation that would haunt all three of them for months to come. Camilla had hoped until the last moment that Charles would find a way to include her children, perhaps in a separate celebration or through some creative interpretation of family protocols. Instead, she found herself having to explain why her son and daughter would not be welcome at her first Christmas as queen consort. The conversation took place in Camilla's private sitting room at Clarence House, a space that had always felt warm and welcoming to her children. The irony of excluding them from royal celebrations while sitting in a room filled with their childhood photographs and family mementos was not lost on any of them. Tom's reaction was one of resigned disappointment rather than surprise. As a professional food writer, he had covered enough high society events to understand how institutional pressures could override personal relationships. He had watched his mother navigate these complexities for years and had always suspected that his own position would become more precarious once Charles became king. Laura's response was more emotional and direct. As the younger of Camilla's two children, she had grown up with Charles as a constant presence in her life. Her children considered him a beloved grandfather figure, and the idea of explaining to them why they wouldn't be joining the traditional Christmas celebration was heartbreaking. The most painful aspect was the systematic way in which the exclusion was being implemented. Rather than a single dramatic confrontation or clear explanation, Camilla's family was experiencing death by 1,000 small cuts. Invitations simply stopped arriving, phone calls weren't returned as promptly, and the warm interactions that had characterized their relationships with palace staff became increasingly formal and distant. Charles himself was struggling with the decision more than anyone realized. In private moments, he would find himself staring at family photographs that included Camilla's children, remembering holidays and celebrations when their blended family had felt natural and joyful. The institutional pressure to create clear boundaries was understandable from a practical standpoint, but the human cost was becoming devastating. The Christmas morning service at Sandringham provided a public glimpse of the new family dynamics. Photographers noted the tight formation of the immediate royal family as they walked to church, with no sign of the extended family members who had sometimes been included in previous years. The images told the story more clearly than any official statement could have done. Camilla's performance during the Christmas broadcast preparation revealed the strain she was under. Always professional and composed in public settings, she found herself struggling to project the warmth and happiness that viewers expected from royal Christmas messages. Makeup artists and camera operators noticed her unusual tension, though none dared to comment directly on what might be causing it. The new year brought a cascade of social events where the new protocols would be tested and refined. The annual New Year's honors reception, traditionally an opportunity for the monarch to recognize achievement and service across British society, became another venue for demonstrating the evolved family boundaries. Andrew Parker Bowles, Camilla's ex-husband, found himself in a particularly complex position. His military background and social connections had always made him a natural fit for certain royal events, but his status as the Queen Consort's former husband created unprecedented protocol challenges. The decision to exclude him from events where he might once have been welcomed sent ripples through military and social circles where he remained popular and respected. The impact on Charles's grandchildren through Camilla was perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire situation. Young children who had grown accustomed to being part of extended royal family gatherings suddenly found themselves on the outside of a world they had considered their own. The careful explanations about why certain invitations weren't coming anymore were impossible to make without causing confusion and hurt feelings. Palace staff members, many of whom had developed genuine affection for Camilla's family over the years, found themselves implementing policies that felt unnecessarily cruel. The professional obligation to follow orders conflicted with their personal feelings about people they had watched grow up and had come to consider part of the royal household's extended family. The silence that began to characterize these exclusions was more powerful than any direct confrontation could have been. Rather than explaining decisions or providing clear rationale for the changes, palace officials simply stopped including certain people in planning and communication. Phone calls went unreturned, email invitations were mysteriously delayed or lost, and the warm personal touches that had made royal interactions feel genuine were systematically eliminated. International observers began to comment on the shift in royal family dynamics, with foreign media drawing unfavorable comparisons between the British approach to blended families and the more inclusive practices of other European monarchies. The Swedish and Norwegian royal families, in particular, were praised for their ability to integrate step relationships and modern family structures into their ceremonial and social functions. The pressure on Camilla was becoming visible to those who knew her well. Friends from her pre-royal life noticed that she seemed less spontaneous in conversation, more careful about which family stories she shared, and increasingly reluctant to discuss future plans that might involve her children. The joy that had characterized her approach to royal duties was being overshadowed by the constant tension of managing divided loyalties. Charles's own children were watching the situation with growing concern. William, despite understanding the institutional arguments for clear boundaries, was troubled by the obvious impact on his stepmother's happiness and on his father's peace of mind. Harry, already critical of royal family dynamics, saw the treatment of Camilla's family as confirmation of the institution's capacity for institutional cruelty. The spring social season brought a series of events where the new exclusionary policies would be tested in increasingly public settings. The Chelsea Flower Show, Royal Ascot, and various garden parties provided opportunities for royal watchers to document exactly who was included and who was notably absent from royal gatherings. Tom Parker Bowles' absence from food-related royal events was particularly conspicuous, given his professional expertise and previous involvement in royal food and hospitality functions. His knowledge of organic farming and sustainable food practices had made him a valuable informal advisor on topics close to Charles's heart, but those consultations quietly ceased as the boundaries between professional and personal relationships were redrawn. Laura's exclusion from equestrian events was equally noticeable to those familiar with royal circles. Her genuine passion for horses and her skill as a rider had made her a natural participant in royal sporting events, but her presence was now considered potentially problematic for public perception and protocol management. The cumulative effect of these systematic exclusions was creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and tension that extended far beyond Camilla's immediate family. Other royal family members began to wonder about their own security within the institution, questioning whether changing circumstances might similarly affect their own status and access. Palace courtiers, having successfully implemented the policy of distancing the king from his stepfamily, began to push for additional measures to clarify and formalize the new boundaries. Suggestions were made for official statements about family protocols, clear guidelines for media interaction, and even consideration of formal titles or lack thereof for various family members. Charles found himself increasingly isolated in his own household, caught between the institutional pressures that demanded clear hierarchies and his personal feelings about the people who had become important parts of his life through his marriage to Camilla. The easy warmth that had characterized his personal relationships was being replaced by careful diplomacy and constant calculation about the broader implications of every interaction. The silence that had begun as a practical response to complex protocol questions was evolving into something more systematic and permanent. What had started as temporary measures to establish clear boundaries during the transition to Charles's reign was becoming the new normal for how Camilla's family would be treated within the royal ecosystem. As summer approached and plans were made for various royal engagements and public appearances, it became clear that the exclusion of Camilla's family was not a temporary adjustment, but a fundamental shift in how the monarchy would manage extended family relationships. The silence that had begun with missing invitations was expanding into a comprehensive redefinition of who counted as family within the royal context. The human cost of these institutional decisions was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone involved, but the momentum of royal protocol and public expectations seemed to make reversal impossible. Charles was learning that being king meant making choices that served the institution even when they contradicted his personal instincts and desires, and the lesson was more painful than he had ever anticipated. By the summer of Charles's first year as king, the exclusion of Camilla's family had become so systematized that it required no active decision-making. Palace staff had internalized the new protocols to such a degree that Tom and Laura Parker Bowles simply ceased to exist in the planning and execution of royal events. The silence had become deafening precisely because it no longer needed to be actively maintained. The impact on Camilla's marriage was becoming increasingly visible to those close enough to observe the subtle changes in her relationship with Charles. Their public appearances maintained the polished professionalism that decades of royal training had instilled in both of them, but private moments had become fraught with unspoken tensions about family, loyalty, and the price of wearing the crown. Palace insiders began to notice that Charles and Camilla's evening conversations, once filled with easy banter and shared planning for family events, had become careful exchanges of information about separate schedules and individual obligations. The natural flow of married life was being disrupted by the constant need to navigate around topics that might lead to conflict or painful reminders of what had been lost. The most devastating moment came during the planning for Tom Parker Bowles' 50th birthday celebration. In previous years, such a milestone would have warranted at least some acknowledgement from the royal family, perhaps a private dinner or quiet celebration that recognized his importance in Camilla's life. This year, the date passed with complete silence from all royal quarters. Camilla found herself in the impossible position of celebrating her son's birthday privately, while publicly maintaining the fiction that family relationships within the royal sphere were harmonious and inclusive. The cognitive dissonance was taking a toll on her mental and emotional well-being that was becoming noticeable to friends and staff members who interacted with her regularly. Charles, meanwhile, was discovering that the institutional pressure for family exclusions was expanding beyond Camilla's relatives to include broader questions about royal access and proximity. Palace advisors were conducting comprehensive reviews of everyone who had regular contact with the royal family, looking for opportunities to streamline relationships and eliminate potential complications. The efficiency with which the exclusion had been implemented was actually becoming a source of concern for some palace staff members. The systematic removal of people from royal circles was creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty among those who remained, as everyone began to wonder whether they might be next to face the silence of official disapproval. Prince William was privately struggling with the broader implications of his father's approach to family management. While he understood the institutional arguments for clear boundaries, he was beginning to worry about the precedent being set for his own future reign. The idea of managing family relationships through systematic exclusion rather than diplomatic inclusion seemed both unnecessarily harsh and potentially counterproductive. The international diplomatic community was taking notice of the changes in royal family dynamics, with several foreign ambassadors making discreet inquiries about the status of various family members for protocol planning purposes. The confusion about who exactly counted as royal family was creating complications for state visit planning and official entertainment that required careful management by Foreign Office staff. Media coverage was becoming increasingly focused on the family dynamics, with royal correspondents beginning to ask direct questions about the absence of Camilla's children from various events. Palace press officers found themselves crafting increasingly creative explanations for patterns that were becoming too obvious to ignore or dismiss as coincidental. The summer garden parties at Buckingham Palace provided the most public demonstration of the new family exclusions. These events, traditionally inclusive celebrations that showcased the breadth of royal family relationships and charitable connections, now operated with military precision in terms of who was invited and who was conspicuously absent. Laura Lopez found herself excluded not only from royal events, but also from charity functions where she had previously been welcomed as a supporter and volunteer. Organizations that had appreciated her quiet contributions and genuine commitment to various causes were suddenly reluctant to include her in planning or public activities, fearing that association with her might somehow complicate their relationships with official royal patronage. The ripple effects extended to social circles beyond the immediate royal family. Friends and acquaintances of Camilla's children found themselves navigating complex social dynamics, unsure whether maintaining friendships might somehow impact their own access to royal events or social opportunities. The fear of guilt by association was creating a broader atmosphere of social uncertainty. Charles's own grandchildren, through Camilla, were perhaps the most confused victims of the new protocols. Children who had grown up considering themselves part of an extended royal family suddenly found themselves excluded from events and celebrations that had once been routine parts of their lives. The careful explanations about why certain invitations weren't coming anymore were impossible to make without causing lasting emotional damage. The Christmas planning for Charles's second year as king became the ultimate test of how permanent and comprehensive the family exclusions had become. Palace staff prepared detailed guest lists with the efficiency of a military operation, carefully excluding any mention of Camilla's family, while maintaining the pretense that decisions were being made based on space constraints and intimate family preferences. Camilla's reaction to the second Christmas exclusion was notably different from her response the previous year. Rather than attempting to negotiate or explain, she seemed to retreat into a kind of protective emotional distance that worried those who knew her well. The vibrant, engaging woman who had brought such life to royal events was becoming more reserved and careful in her public interactions. The systematic nature of the exclusion was creating psychological pressure that extended far beyond simple disappointment about missing events. Camilla's children found themselves questioning their memories of previous relationships and wondering whether the warmth they had experienced from Charles and other royal family members had ever been genuine or had simply been part of a performance that was no longer necessary. Tom Parker Bowles, as a professional writer and media personality, was facing particular pressure about how to navigate his public persona while dealing with the private reality of his exclusion from his mother's royal life. Interview requests and media opportunities often included questions about royal family relationships that he could no longer answer honestly without creating additional complications for everyone involved. The most painful aspect of the situation was the way it was affecting Camilla's relationship with her grandchildren. Children who had grown up with stories about their grandmother's important role and their connection to the royal family were now having to navigate the complex reality that those connections had been quietly severed without explanation or acknowledgement. Palace staff members who had developed genuine affection for Camilla's family over the years were struggling with their own complicity in the exclusion process. Many had attended family celebrations, watched children grow up, and developed real relationships that were now being systematically terminated as part of their professional obligations. The efficiency of the exclusion system was creating a chilling effect throughout the royal household, as staff members realized how quickly and completely relationships could be terminated when they no longer served institutional purposes. The personal warmth that had characterized many royal relationships was being replaced by careful professionalism and emotional distance. Charles himself was showing signs of the strain that came from maintaining institutional discipline while dealing with the personal cost of family separation. Friends and advisors noticed that he seemed less spontaneous in his interactions, more careful about displaying affection or personal connection, and increasingly focused on maintaining appropriate distances rather than building genuine relationships. The transformation was particularly visible during Charles's interactions with children at public events. Previously known for his natural warmth and genuine interest in young people, he now maintained more formal boundaries that reflected his awareness of how any display of familial affection might be scrutinized and potentially create complications for official protocol management. The silence that had begun with missing invitations had evolved into something far more comprehensive and devastating. It was no longer just about excluding Camilla's family from specific events. It was about erasing their existence from the narrative of royal family life entirely. The systematic nature of this erasure was creating psychological and emotional damage that extended far beyond simple social disappointment. As Charles's second year as king progressed, it became clear that the exclusionary policies were not temporary measures designed to establish clear boundaries during a transition period. They had become permanent features of how the monarchy would operate under his reign, with implications that extended far beyond the specific situation of Camilla's family to questions about how the institution would handle all relationships that didn't fit easily into traditional royal structures. 3 years into Charles's reign, the transformation was complete, but the victory felt hollow to everyone involved. The palace operated with unprecedented efficiency, family boundaries were crystal clear, and public confusion about royal relationships had been eliminated. Yet the human cost of achieving this institutional perfection had fundamentally changed the character of the monarchy itself, turning it into something that served protocol better than it served the people who comprised it. Camilla had adapted to her new reality with the grace that had always characterized her approach to difficult situations. But those who knew her well could see how profoundly the systematic exclusion of her family had affected her. The spontaneous warmth that had made her such an effective royal consort was still present in her public appearances, but it was now carefully managed and strategically deployed rather than emerging naturally from genuine happiness and family security. The queen consort had become a master of compartmentalization, maintaining separate emotional spaces for her role as Charles's wife and her identity as a mother and grandmother. Palace staff noticed that she never mentioned her children during work conversations, never referenced family plans that might include them, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to redirect conversations away from topics that might create uncomfortable silences. Charles himself had evolved into a more efficient, but less emotionally accessible monarch than anyone had expected. The easy charm and personal warmth that had characterized his years as Prince of Wales had been replaced by professional competence and careful boundary management. He had learned to love conditionally, to express affection only within contexts that served institutional purposes, and to suppress personal instincts that might complicate royal protocols. The broader royal family had learned to navigate around the invisible boundaries that now defined acceptable relationships and interactions. William and Catherine had mastered the art of acknowledging Camilla's happiness while never inquiring about her children. Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties had been influenced partly by their observation of how ruthlessly the institution could exclude people who had once been considered family members. Palace staff members had internalized the new protocols so completely that they no longer required active management or supervision. The systematic exclusion of Camilla's family had become part of the institutional DNA, something that would persist regardless of who occupied specific positions or made individual decisions. The silence had become self-perpetuating and permanent. Tom and Laura Parker Bowles had rebuilt their lives around the reality of their exclusion, finding new social circles and professional opportunities that didn't depend on royal connection or approval. Their children had grown up understanding that their grandmother was an important public figure whom they loved, but saw only in private settings that bore no resemblance to the royal life they glimpsed in media coverage. The most profound change was in the character of royal celebrations themselves. Events that had once felt like genuine family gatherings, with all the messy complexity and authentic emotion that real families bring to important moments, now operated like precisely choreographed performances where every participant understood their role and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Christmas at Sandringham had become a masterpiece of efficient family management, with guest lists that included only people whose presence served clear institutional purposes and whose relationships with the monarch could be easily explained in traditional terms. The informal conversations and spontaneous moments that had once made these gatherings feel authentic had been replaced by careful exchanges that never strayed beyond safe topics. The international community had noted and adapted to the British royal family's approach to managing complex relationships. Diplomatic protocols had been adjusted to reflect the reality that certain family members who might logically be included in official functions would not be present, eliminating the confusion that had characterized early attempts to navigate the new family dynamics. Media coverage had evolved as well, with royal correspondents learning to ask different questions and focus on different aspects of royal family life. The systematic nature of certain exclusions had become so obvious that direct questions were no longer necessary. The story was told through absence rather than presence, through careful observation of who appeared where and when. The impact on public perception of the monarchy was complex and multifaceted. Some observers praised Charles for bringing clarity and efficiency to royal family management, eliminating the confusion and complications that had sometimes characterized previous approaches to extended family relationships. Others worried that the systematic exclusion of step-family members sent negative messages about modern family structures and the monarchy's ability to reflect contemporary British society. Palace officials had achieved their primary objectives of reducing security costs, eliminating protocol confusion, and establishing clear hierarchies within royal family relationships. The institutional efficiency they had sought was undeniable, and the problems they had worried about had indeed been solved. Yet the success felt increasingly Pyrrhic as the human cost became more apparent over time. Charles's relationship with his own children had been affected by the broader changes in family management style. William and Harry had both noticed their father's increased emotional distance and careful approach to personal relationships. The spontaneous affection and casual family interaction that had characterized their childhood was being replaced by more formal exchanges that reflected Charles's learned wariness about mixing personal feeling with institutional responsibility. The transformation was perhaps most visible in Charles's interactions with grandchildren. Previously known for his delight in young people and his natural ability to connect with children, he now maintained careful boundaries that reflected his awareness of how any display of familial warmth might create complications if it couldn't be extended equally to all family members in all circumstances. Camilla's adaptation to her constrained role had required remarkable emotional discipline and personal sacrifice. She had learned to suppress natural maternal instincts in favor of institutional loyalty, to prioritize her husband's royal obligations over her own family relationships, and to present a public face of happiness while privately managing the ongoing grief of systematic family separation. The grandchildren who had been excluded from royal family life had grown up with confused and often painful understandings of their place in the world. Some struggled with questions about why their grandmother was important enough to appear on television and in newspapers, but not important enough to include them in her public life. Others developed resentment about the arbitrary nature of family boundaries that seemed to serve abstract institutional purposes rather than human needs. Palace staff members who had implemented the exclusionary policies found themselves working in an environment where personal relationships were viewed with suspicion and emotional investment in family dynamics was considered professionally dangerous. The warm, familial atmosphere that had once characterized royal households was replaced by efficient professionalism that served institutional purposes, but eliminated much of the human warmth that had made royal service personally rewarding. The long-term implications of the systematic exclusion extended far beyond the immediate situation of Camilla's family. Future generations of royals would inherit a model of family management that prioritized institutional efficiency over personal relationships, protocol compliance over human connection, and public perception over private happiness. The silence that had begun with missing Christmas invitations had evolved into a comprehensive redefinition of what family meant within the royal context. It was no longer about blood relationships, marriage bonds, or personal affection. It was about serving institutional purposes and maintaining public clarity about roles and responsibilities. As Charles's reign continued and the exclusionary policies became increasingly normalized, the palace had indeed been changed forever. The efficiency and clarity that advisors had sought had been achieved, but at the cost of transforming the monarchy into something more institutional and less human than it had been before. The deafening silence that had characterized the exclusion of Camilla's family had become a template for managing all relationships that didn't serve clear institutional purposes. The lesson had been learned and internalized. Personal feelings and family bonds were acceptable only when they served the broader purposes of the monarchy, and when they created complications, they could and would be systematically eliminated regardless of the human cost. The palace that Charles had inherited as a place of complex but genuine family relationships had been transformed into an efficient institution where love was conditional, family was defined by usefulness, and silence had become the most powerful tool for managing human complications that threatened institutional perfection. The crown had been preserved, but the cost had been higher than anyone had initially realized or acknowledged.